Jim Crow, separate and unequal. The Jim Crow era began when Reconstruction ended in 1877. Southern states passed laws that made segregation a way of life. The laws became known as Jim Crow laws. These laws forced African Americans to be separated from whites. White Southern politicians said African Americans would still get equal treatment even if African Americans and whites led very separate lives. But this did not happen. African Americans faced worse living conditions than whites. Many whites used Jim Crows to keep African American under their power. So many laws. The first major Jim Crow law was passed in 1890 in New Orleans, Louisiana. The city stated African Americans could not ride in the same railroad cars as white people. Instead, they could only travel in cars for coloreds. These cars were usually dirty. Sometimes the cars were even shared by animals being sent to the butcher. Most of the laws ordered businesses and public places to keep white people and African Americans separate. Restaurants could not serve food to whites and African Americans in the same room. Whites and African Americans could not play any games together. White and African American children could not attend the same schools. Employers had to provide separate bathrooms for white and African American men. Other laws stated African Americans could not date, marry, or touch whites. Losing the vote and rights. At the same time, Southern states took away African Americans' rights to vote. Southern politicians passed laws that made voters pay a poll tax. That is, you had to pay a tax in order to vote. Most Black people couldn't afford to pay the tax, and if you didn't pay the tax, you weren't allowed to vote. The poll tax kept most from voting. This meant that the white politicians could continue to pass unfair laws. Slavery may have ended decades before, but African Americans living in the South were not free. Many former slaves worked for former slave owners. Many white employers gave the hardest jobs to African American employees. African Americans were paid lower wages than the white employee who did the easiest work. Growing up under Jim Crow. It was not against the law for young children of different races to play together, but white children and African American children had separate playgrounds, schools, and parks. Facilities were not equal either. Local governments made the public spaces for white children better than those for African American children. Playgrounds for African Americans were often weedy corner lots. They had broken down slides and swings. Schools had free books or supplies. White children had new playground equipment. They had plenty of books and supplies at school. To keep their children safe, African American parents taught their children to obey the Jim Crow laws. Many also taught their children pride in being African American. They might be secondary in the eyes of the law, but they were not secondary in truth. Cycle of poverty. African Americans receive poorer education than whites. Employers use this as an excuse. They refused to hire African Americans for jobs, or they paid them poorly and gave them more difficult jobs. Often, a white person could not do a job well was hired instead of an African American who could do the job well. The system of racist laws and practices made sure that most African Americans stayed poor no matter how hard they worked. African Americans had no say in government. Much of their time was spent trying to follow the Jim Crow laws and take care of their families. Unjust crimes and punishment. Punishment for breaking Jim Crow laws was as unjust as the law themselves. White people ran the police and the court system. An African American man who forgot to tip his hat to a white person could be fined or put in prison. Some laws applied to white people who tried to help African Americans. One ordered white teachers to pay a fine for teaching African Americans. The harshest act under Jim Crow was lynching. This was often when a white mob hung an African American. Whites who performed these acts used them to intimidate African Americans. Lynching took the lives of 4,715 Black men, women, and children from 1882 to 1946. There were more lynchings in the South than in any other part of the country. These were public events. Sometimes hundreds of white people attended in photos we can see many white people smiling. White people often did not hide their crimes. Those who murdered African Americans were rarely arrested. When they were arrested, they were often found not guilty.